Okay, we're talking about Jewish survival, and we were talking about whether or not there could be a natural explanation. And we gave a list of things that need to be explained, and we considered persecution and a natural ability to create long-lasting cultural products as possible explanations, and we said they don't fit the facts. And what we're going to look at today is probably the most popular, most intuitive way of explaining Jewish survival, and that is Judaism has in it elements that naturally promote the survival of the culture, identity, the group. In particular, it has in it isolating laws and practices, maybe even institutions which result in isolation, even though they don't preach isolation. So you have kashrus, which means you can't eat at the table of non-Jews, although you could invite them for supper. They can eat with you, but you can't eat with them, and probably a one-way relationship, unbalanced relationship is going to be inhibited. And you can't intermarry. Prayer requires a certain minimum number of Jews and only Jews. And then you have your own religion with its own language, which is different from everybody else's language, and customs that are different from everybody else's customs, dress. And those things are naturally going to isolate. So the thought is Judaism has in it elements that naturally isolate Jews from their surroundings, and that's why they've survived, because they have these isolating features built into their way of life. There are a number of things wrong with this thought. Number one, we're trying to explain why Judaism survived and other cultures disappeared. Well, then the first question to ask is, did other cultures also have isolating features? If this was a widespread quality of ancient cultures, that they all had isolating features, it will not do to say Judaism survived because it had isolating features, even though the other cultures also had isolating features and they disappeared. That's not going to work as an explanation. Now, for example, I saw one historian document that every ancient nation has food taboos. And they all have different food taboos. So if a food taboo has the effect of isolating people, then every ancient nation had at least that element of isolation. If you talk about having a religion with your language and the religion different from everybody else's language, every ancient nation had that, because they had their own language and their religion was in their language. And they had customs which set themselves apart, special types of dress, special holidays, special texts. So every ancient culture had in it isolating factors. So that being the case, just citing the fact that we have features that serve to isolate doesn't explain why we survived and they all disappeared. No one who uses this argument, the argument that we have, natural isolating features, even asks this question. That's how poor the logical articulation of this study is. No one asks the question, but what about other cultures that disappeared? Did they have them? And if so, what makes us different? No one even asks that question. And someone who studied philosophy of science and logic, find this almost astonishing. These people are purporting to explain a great historical puzzle, and they don't use the most elementary logical methodology. But then there's another way in which they pursue this, which I think is an example of something that's a little more subtle. Suppose someone says, others had food taboos, but they didn't have our food taboos. So maybe it's our food taboos that lead to survival, and their food taboos that don't. I think there's a fallacy here. There's a logical fallacy here. I'll illustrate it with an absurd extreme example, and I'll show you how it works. The first runner to break the 4-minute mile was Roger Bannister, great British runner. Until he did it, there was a kind of myth among runners that it can't be done. If you run the mile in less than 4 minutes, you're going to drop dead. He did it that year, 4 or 5 other people did it. It was like a psychological barrier that other people couldn't master, and he mastered. Now the question is, why was he the first one to do it? Why was he the first one to do it? Why didn't anybody else do it? What feature determined that fact that he was going to be the first one to break the 4-minute mile? I have a suggestion. He's the only runner whose name was Roger Bannister. I mean, isn't it true that he's the first one to do it? He's the only one with that name? So, if he's the one you're trying to explain, he's the only one with that name, I hope you agree with me, that's colossally stupid. The fact that he's the one you're trying to explain and he has this unique feature doesn't mean that this unique feature explains what you want to explain. There has to be a connection. We normally think the name of a person has nothing to do with how fast he runs. That might not have been that way. Maybe in the English school that he went to, the name Roger was looked down upon and people made fun of him and persecuted him. He had to run away, so he learned to run fast. Okay, if so, then maybe the blame did. But normally we think the fact that he alone broke it first and he alone has the name doesn't mean there's a connection. Okay, that's what I call the Roger Bannister fallacy. Now, we're trying to explain why Judaism and Judaism alone survived as a culture from the ancient world. Somebody says, well, let's see. Judaism alone survived, and Judaism alone has Q, so it must be that Q explains why Judaism survived. That's wrong. That's wrong. Simply finding some unique feature, Q, that Judaism has, isn't even a candidate for an explanation of survival. There has to be some intuitive connection between the unique Q that you find and the survival. So now, somebody says, well, isolating features will lead to survival. That at least has an intuition. I'm going to attack that intuition in a minute. But that at least has an intuition. Sets you apart, so you're different. And if you're different, you're probably going to keep your identity. But now you say, well, they all had food taboos. Maybe it's the Jewish food taboo that leads to survival, and the other food taboos don't. That has absolutely no intuitive backing. This group doesn't eat snails, and that group doesn't eat cows. Oh, not eating snails will preserve you, but not eating cows won't preserve you. Like, there's nothing. That's just Roger Bannister. It's a unique feature, and you're just throwing it in because it's unique. That's not a candidate for an explanation. I need at least some intuition, some experiential understanding of how it works to suggest that this is a candidate for explaining how we survived. And of course, if you're going to break down and talk about differences in detail, you're not going to have that. Every country had a religion based on its own language, different from all other languages. Somebody says, yeah, that's true, but they didn't have Hebrew. They didn't have Hebrew. Only Judaism has Hebrew. So maybe it's Hebrew that keeps you alive. That's ridiculous. There's no reason why Hebrew, rather than Sanskrit, should maintain the existence of a culture, and the culture should disappear. There's got to be some reason, intuition, some experience would lead you to think that this feature will promote survival, and others that don't have it are going to be inferior in survival. That's the second problem. The third problem is that even with the isolating features, it's not obvious. Although we do have an intuition, it will isolate us, set us apart. It's not obvious that that intuition is accurate in reality. I'll explain to you why. Let's take kashrus. Let's think of the people who immigrated to the United States from Europe, Jews, from 1880 through 1930. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more, came over those decades. Now, the vast majority of them grew up in religious homes and had religious practices, religious identity. Come to New York. New York is a melting pot. There are Greeks and Poles and Italians, Irish, and all sorts of immigrants coming from a starving Europe, and they're all trying to do the best that they can. Now let's imagine the following scenario. A Jew arrives, doesn't speak the language, has no obvious saleable skills. There are other Jews around, willing to help them as best they can, and it's rough. There are lots of immigrants there, and some of them are anti-Semites. Imagine that a local Italian takes this Jew under his wing for the fancy. Listen, you're new here. and you need to be oriented, you need some job training, so on and so on, count on me. I'm your friend, I'll help you. And he does help you. Gets a place to be trained and helps him learn the language, stuff and so on. And of course, the Jew is very grateful. Now, after a period of time, the Italian says, we become friendly, and I like you. I'm glad I'm able to help you. Come for dinner. We're having veal parmesan. If you know what veal parmesan is veal cooked in cheese. And let me tell you, it's terrific. Absolutely terrific. Now the Jew's in a pickle because it's treif. So what's he going to do? Go for dinner and eat the treif meat, treif food? Not go for dinner? Risk offending his Italian patron, his Italian protector and friend? You imagine a crisis like that. I think you could see that some people will do it one way and some people will do it the other way. Some people will say no, stick to their principles, and take the risk of losing the Italian friend. And some people say, no, I can't do that. I can't afford to take that risk. And that being the case, I'm going to go. Of course, if he goes, he's broken a Jewish rule. Since he's broken a Jewish rule, his connection to Judaism becomes weaker. Now, I want you to imagine an alternative scenario. The same facts, the Italian friend, the help, the gratitude, just change Judaism into Judaism star, Judaism minus kashrus. There's no dietary laws. Now when the Italian says, come to me for dinner, it's a meal of parmesan, terrific, I'll be there with bells. And he goes and he eats and he enjoys, and there's no weakening of his connection to the Jewish religion at all. I think you could see that having a rule of kashrus creates a conflict for him that a Judaism without kashrus wouldn't create. It creates a temptation, and it creates a situation in which some Jews are going to fail the test and they're going to be distanced from their Judaism. The rule of kashrus is going to work against Jewish identity. Now, every Jewish group in the world is an immigrant group. Even the Jews in Israel are immigrants to Israel. I know there's 1/10 of 1%, we'll go back 17 generations. But all the groups are. So it means every immigrant group, every Jewish group experienced this kind of conflict, this kind of tension, this kind of crisis. That means sometimes kashrus is going to work against Jewish survival. Now what we need is a bottom line calculation. Take all of the negative effects of kashrus and all the positive effects of kashrus and make a bottom line evaluation that is it on the whole beneficial or on the whole destructive of Jewish identity. No one has even attempted this because no one has thought of the problem. I'll give you another example of this. Selo W. Baron, one of the celebrated historians of the Jewish historian of the 20th century. I say celebrated in those terms because I don't think he's so great a historian, but nobody cares about what I think. But in secular terms, he's thought of as one. He put out a 20-volume thing called The Social and Religious History of the Jews, from Abraham on. He says that we have a law against intermarriage. In the end of the Second Temple period, in the land of Israel, there were so many non-Jews living together with Jews that it was hard to find marriage partners. And there was widespread intermarriage. So then, the rule against intermarriage works against the survival of this group because many are going to intermarry no matter what. And once they intermarry, they're cut off. And once they're cut off, they're going to lose their Jewish identities. Whereas, if you had, like a certain group that I'm going to talk about in a minute, if you had no restriction against intermarriage, and when there's intermarriage, you can just welcome the new spouse into the group, then there wouldn't be that negative effect. So having an isolating law doesn't automatically improve the chances of survival. When you have this intuition, oh yeah, we have that law and it isolates us, what you're assuming, without realizing it, is that you're talking about a law that's going to be kept. Kashrus will isolate us because those people who keep kosher are more likely to retain their Jewish identity. That's true. Those who actually do keep kosher, those who actually do anything Jewish, are more likely to survive as Jews than those who don't do that thing, other things being equal. But having a law in the books means that some people are going to fail. And those people who are going to fail are going to be more pushed away from Judaism because of that law. So then to say that the law contributes to survival, you have to know the sum total effect. And that's not easy to calculate. Indeed, early reform, which threw over many of these laws, early reform was not trying to have Judaism commit suicide. They weren't looking to disappear. Their argument was the opposite. Their argument was, if you force a Jew to keep kosher, he can't go to university. He can't get a good job. He won't be respected by the non-Jews. Then he's going to become a Christian. Many Jews in Germany did convert to Christianity. If you drop kashrus, you're going to make a positive effect on Jewish survival because the Jew no longer has that conflict. If he doesn't have to keep kosher, he doesn't have to keep Shabbos strictly, so then he can go to university, he can get a job, he can be accepted, and he can retain the rest of his Jewish identity. It's insisting on all of it. That means you're going to lose all of it. If you compromise with some, you'll be able to keep the rest. That was the reform thought. Now, let's play back the Roger Bannister fallacy. The natural reaction of people is, yeah, that's what they thought, but they were wrong. Why were they wrong? Because you see, they ended up assimilating, and the people who kept it ended up surviving. That's the Roger Bannister fallacy. Because we now have a reason to think that the laws will work against survival. So what do you say back? Yeah, but these guys survived, those guys didn't. They survived, and they had Q, so Q must explain their survival. That's not an argument. That's the Roger Bannister fallacy. If you have a reason for thinking that the laws are going to work against you, you don't prove that that reason is wrong by saying, but we survived. Maybe we survived in spite of the laws, not because of the laws. So we now have three reasons to think that this sort of explanation is not going to do the job. I have a fourth reason. Let's imagine that all the three reasons I gave you are not correct. Let's imagine that they do naturally lead to survival. Let's imagine that we have them alone and other ancient societies didn't have them. You'd still have to ask where they came from. Where did they come from? How did they get put in place? Were they created as a survival package or not? Well, if they were created as a survival package, and remember who's talking now. The person who's talking now is a naturalist. He believes in the natural world, doesn't believe in God, divine providence. Means people thought it up. People thought up these kinds of rules which will enable you to be able to survive. So the question will be, why didn't other cultures also think up those rules? Didn't they want to survive? Every culture wants to survive. Every culture wants its children and grandchildren to walk in the same ways, especially if you have a religion. And they all had religions in the ancient world. So if you're really chauvinistic, you say, we're just smarter than everybody else. But they could have copied us. Could have copied us. We hung around for a long time, 1,000 years before the destruction of the temple, 2,000 years afterwards. Couldn't they look at us and say, hey, these guys are doing well. They've got something. Let's figure out what it is. And let's copy it. So we'll do well also. So you say, well, I guess it wasn't put in place as a survival package, and it wasn't observable that it's a survival package. It wasn't obvious. It was obvious other people would have imitated it, but it wasn't obvious. If it wasn't put in place for that reason, and it wasn't obvious, I want to know, how did it get obvious now? What do you know now that people didn't know 500 years ago about what enables cultures to survive and what enables cultures to disappear? What are you operating on, after all? You're operating on what in yeshivas they call a boichsvara. It means a gut feeling. You have no statistics, you have no comparative studies, you just say, yeah, kashrus will keep us separate, so that's why we're separate. People couldn't say that 500 years ago? 1,000 years ago? I say there's no explanation whatsoever of how this package of institutions is responsible for survival in naturalistic terms. Nobody recognized it, nobody understood it, nobody observed it, nobody copied it, and now all of a sudden we know that it's true. I think there's absolutely no basis for a judgment like that. So I think that the whole effort to explain Jewish survival in naturalistic terms, at least so far, is bankrupt. Now I'll go back and just repeat what I said at the beginning yesterday. The natural thing to say is, okay, so it's bankrupt so far. Maybe tomorrow. I pointed out yesterday that we don't always do that. We don't always say, here's something that needs to be explained, and I look at my resources of explaining it. just doesn't seem to work, and say, well, it just doesn't seem to work. Tomorrow we'll produce a genius, and he'll figure it out. We don't always do that. Sometimes we change the way we look at the world. The nuclear force is one example. Unconscious is another example, where certain things were observed, they couldn't be explained, and people said, and they're not going to be explained. And not going to be explained, therefore we have to change our picture of how the world works. That's the only way to get an explanation. Sometimes that's the right move intellectually. Now, can I demonstrate for you that's the right move here? All I can say to you is that this is not a new problem. 1,000 years ago, people were already aware that the Jewish history is different from everybody else's history. And no one in all of the history of trying to explain these things has taken a shot at it. I must tell you, two great historical movements in the 20th century. One in the 19th, 20th century is Marxism. The other was Arnold Toynbee, great British historian. Both of them had theories of the history of the world, how the world works, how the world develops, what the dynamics are. The Jewish people was an exception to both of them, a contradiction to both of them, and they had nothing to say about it. They had nothing to say about it. The Marxist position is that everything in your culture is determined by the economy. Sport, poetry, art, religion is all determined by the economy. Different economies produce different sport and arts and political forms and religion. But we've lived under every economy with the same religion. Toynbee was so stymied by the Jewish people that he described us as the fossils of history. Fossils. Fossils are dead. They're pieces of stone in the ground. Well, pieces of stone in the ground don't repopulate their ancient nation and create a new government and resurrect a 2,000-year-old language. Fossils don't do that. By calling us fossils, he just declared bankruptcy. I can't say anything about the Jews. They don't fit. Well, we don't fit. Now, that being the case, if there isn't a natural explanation, then one has to look for something that goes beyond what the normal natural explanations provide. The final factor is that this is predicted. The Torah says that we're an eternal people. The Torah says in Deuteronomy 28 through 30 that we're never going to disappear. We're going to come back to the land from which we started. It was predicted before it happened. Well, that indicates that whoever's responsible for the text knew about it. And if the text knew about it, then it's related to whatever it is that made it happen. Okay, time for a short summary and the conclusion that I want to draw. And then this discussion we can have until 5 o'clock. We saw three elements of evidence. We saw reason to believe that Revelation Sinai is a real historical event. We saw a prediction in Deuteronomy 28 through 30 about conquest and exile and survival and return. And we saw the survival of the Jewish people. Now, the first step is to ask, what's the minimum I have to accept to explain those things? Well, to explain Sinai, I've got to have some agency which can speak to 3 million people simultaneously and can cause a mountain to shake and fire and smoke and the sound of the shofar and the plagues in Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea. Some agency has to be responsible for that. Obviously, that's an agency which isn't restricted by the normal, natural restrictions of agencies that we are aware of. I must tell you, our sources say that it's a demonstration that the agent is the creator of the universe. I don't know how to argue that in modern terms. I know how Maimonides and Nachmanides argued in the Middle Ages. They had certain background assumptions. I don't know how to argue in our terms, but for one thing for sure, no agency known to the whole of mankind would allow 3,300 years ago an agent that could do that. Secondly, this agent, if it's responsible for the prediction in Deuteronomy 28 through 30, either knows the future or knows the future by causing it. And this agent is producing the survival of the Jewish people. That's the survival of a culture over thousands of years against all odds, against all expectations of the environment in which they're living. Well, this agent must be very intelligent. This agent must have considerable power at its disposal. And this agent must care about the Jewish people. Because these things happen to the Jewish people and not other people. Now, if you add to that the fact that The Jews and Judaism, it can be argued, have had a bigger effect on the development of world culture than any other group. Did the Greeks have an impact on world development? You bet. Romans? You bet. What about the Jews? Well, 40% of the world's population is either Christian or Muslim. That means our book became the basis of their entire civilization. And international values of justice and freedom and respect and the brotherhood of man, which are found in our prophets, have become international values. The cornerstone of the United Nations of the world, which I think at present has about 175 nations, the cornerstone is inscribed with a verse from the book of Isaiah. Think yourself back 2,000 years ago. Scattered groups of Jews, the temple destroyed, so on and so on, and ask yourself, what probability would you give that 2,000 years in the future, when the whole of the world will unite under one banner, that a verse from their book will be in the cornerstone? I think the probability would be 0. It's astonishing that's what happened. So, this agent who caused the revelation at Sinai, and who predicted the future of our conquest, exile, and return, and who preserved our identity, this agent doesn't care only about us. Obviously, that agent is using us as a wedge to have an effect on the world as a whole. That much I think you can read right off the record. Now, those descriptions that I gave of this agent are classical Jewish descriptions of God. I think those descriptions can be read right off the record. I think that's the minimum you have to recognize in order to explain the historical record. Of course, that's not all of what Judaism believes about God. Judaism believes lots of other things about God. What about those? Well, you have a classical situation here where you have a body of information. Not all of it is testable. Certainly not all of it is fully testable. You test what you can, and under certain conditions, that gives credibility to the rest. Let's take as an example, which I'm going to use doubly, Newton's law of gravity. Newton's law of gravity says gravity works in a certain way everywhere, every when. That means 13.8 billion years of history, according to their picture, and 20 or more, depending upon problems with relativity, 20 or more billion light years of space in all directions. Gravity works the same way, it's the same everywhere, everyone. How much of that have we tested? What percentage of that have we tested? If you started putting zeros after the decimal point for 16 years, you wouldn't get enough zeros. We've tested a tiny, tiny fraction of it. So how could anyone say that we have reason to believe in this law for everywhere, everyone? The answer is that's how it's done. You have a law which describes everywhere, everyone. You test it, as Richard Feynman pointed out. Don't test it in some selective way, only in South America. No, try to test it in different directions. Try to pick out different times by going back in time, by using the light from stars, which portrays their situation millions or billions of years ago. If you do it in a non-biased way and you get the same results, on the basis of that tiny sample, you have reason to accept the whole. You might be wrong, but you have reason to accept the whole. Now, something like that is going on in our case. We have a body of information. Where we can test it, it tests true, then the rest of it gets confirmation because it's part of the same body of information. I used to say this, saying this for 30 years. About 15 years ago, a student challenged me. And he said that I'm assuming something under the table, and the argument as I presented is not complete, and he was right. What I was assuming, or what I need to assume, or I need to at least show, is that there's a certain level of integration in the information. So the law of gravity is absolutely uniform. Gravity always operates in exactly the same way, and you have a very simple equation that describes it. Let's take as a contrast the New York Times, which is contrasting in many ways. Now, the New York Times has in it sports scores and political commentary and op-eds and the latest discoveries in psychology and so forth and so on. There's lots of different types of information there. The sports scores are going to be 100% accurate. The political commentary is going to be 100% inaccurate. And the op-eds will be somewhere in between. You can't apply the idea of testing it where you can and getting credibility for the whole if the whole has in it many different kinds of information. There has to be some unity in the body of information. So I accepted that from the student. I thanked her very much. It was a very, very good comment. I started to think about it. How unified is the information in the Jewish picture? I think it's quite unified. It can't match gravity, of course, but if you have a scale of 0 to 100 where gravity is at 100 and the New York Times is at 0, I'm just talking about disunity now. I'm not talking about just disunity. I'll talk about the other things some other time. I would put the unification of the Jewish information about 80. After all, we have a story with one simple theme. There's a creator. He created the universe for the sake of benefiting, and benefiting includes earning what we get, and that's the theme of the entire creation. All the rest of it is subclauses following that theme. I think that's unified enough so that if parts get confirmed by our direct observation, the rest of it gets some confirmation, and that's all I need. All I need is that the whole has some confirmation, then it stands or falls on the basis of challenges from other sources. In the meantime, there's support for the whole. So I think that if you ask whether we have support for believing the whole of the Jewish tradition, I think the answer is yes. That's what I wanted to show you. Now, let me make one more remark. Let's imagine that you have two competing theories, A and B. That happens a lot. Usually, A has evidence in its favor, B has evidence in its favor, and then it's quite difficult sometimes to sum up which one is in a better position. Usually it works like this. A has evidence in its favor, and B, which is competing, the evidence in favor of A is against B, counts against B. And likewise, B has its evidence in its favor, and the evidence in favor of B counts against A. That's the usual situation, but not always. Not always. Sometimes A has its evidence, and its evidence counts against B, whereas B has its evidence, and B can explain away A's evidence. B can neutralize A's evidence, so that A's evidence doesn't really count against B. Under those conditions, usually B is the superior choice, because A has positive and negative evidence in the body of evidence. B has positive and neutral. That puts B in a better situation. Now, I think that's a good description of, let's say, the contest between Judaism and science. Judaism has evidence in its favor. I've presented that in a brief fashion over the last few days. Science has evidence in its favor. The Jewish evidence conflicts with science. Science can't explain the Jewish evidence. The Jewish evidence is something which science can't deal with, so it counts against the scientific picture. The evidence in favor of science can be explained away by saying that God made the world look that way. Then the evidence in favor of science doesn't count against Judaism. Judaism can neutralize that evidence. Under those conditions, Judaism is in a superior position. In terms of logic, Judaism is in a superior position. So I don't think that we have to be, we don't have to have an inferiority complex. We don't have to feel that we're somehow second class in terms of our ability to defend ourselves in logical terms. I think we can defend ourselves in logical terms. And we should have the self-confidence that brings, yeah.
Rabbi, you mentioned here in Deuteronomy 28 to 30, and there was a prophecy of things that were to happen, and obviously it was written before the time that it actually happened.
Right.
There's accounts of multiple things happening in that period. How much of that is actually can be verified? Those things occurred at that time.
Okay. Well, I have time to explain this to you. In the written form of this, I write this out in detail. If you look at this chapter, it's a long chapter.
Yeah.
It has in it 3 different types of statements. One is statements of things which would be expected to happen no matter what, and therefore they're not selective, like will be conquered. And everybody gets conquered sooner or later. Another type of statement is poetry, which is vague. The heavens will be iron and the earth will be copper. Well, I suppose that means there'll be very little rain. And I suppose it means that the ground won't be fruitful. Exactly how much rain? 2.7 inches per year? 1/10 of the normal crop? 1/5 of the normal crop? It's very vague. Very vague predictions serve no purpose. Mark me carefully. I don't say they're negative. I don't say they hurt. But they serve no purpose because almost whatever happens, you can say fulfilled it. After all, we're talking about the process of conquest. During conquest, the fields are not very well kept, and droughts happen in this country. I've lived for 35 years. I've lived through 4 major droughts. And droughts happen very often, so that's something which so the heavens are iron. How much iron and how long does it have to be? It's very vague. So if it's vague, then it's too easy to make true. It's something which you'd expect. Historians won't write about it because it's normal. You'll suffer diseases. Sure, if you're on the run, if you're not getting adequate nutrition, if you have cuts and bruises that don't get attended to, you will suffer diseases. You'll get infections and disease will spread. Those kinds of statements, they don't hurt us, but they don't help us. They're to be expected in any fashion. I chose the statements which are precise and which are unlikely to happen in other forms. All of the ones that I told you are public knowledge. Now you can go through it and check for yourself. There's one there that, which is very, I should tell because some people think they have a kind of example. It's not really true. It says it describes people who are always afraid, never secure. So the history of anti-Semitism does seem to be like that. And I say that means, among other things, you won't have a state, because you have a state, you have your own army, you have your own economy, you do have a certain amount of security. And the counterexample that they want to raise for that is the Khazars. You've heard of the book, The Kuzari? The book Kuzari, the name is taken from a country, state in Central Asia, which existed for a couple of centuries. There was a nation called the Khazars. People thought that he made this up, but it isn't true. It's a real fact. And they all converted to Judaism en masse. The entire nation converted to Judaism, and they survived for some centuries, and then something happened, whether either they scattered or they were beaten in a war or something else, and they disappeared. Well, they had their own country for 200 years or more. Doesn't that sound pretty secure? I mean, why would you think that they'd be insecure? That's right, but they're converts. The text is addressing the people who sold the Torah out, who failed to live up to the Torah, and the consequences of that failure. That doesn't apply to converts. They didn't sell the Torah out. Their ancestors didn't sell the Torah out. So there's no reason why the prediction should apply to them. So the fact that they had a functioning state for a couple of centuries and did okay, and they were confident and secure during that time, is not a contradiction to what we're talking about at all. So I think that all of the statements that are there that are precise and are unlikely to come true, those are the ones that I chose because those are the ones that are relevant. And all of them are public record. I didn't say anything that isn't public record.
Do you recall one or two?
Sure, that will be conquered by a nation whose language we don't understand, which didn't have to happen. And we were conquered by Rome. There was no Latin culture in the land of Israel at the time that we were conquered by Rome. There was plenty of Greek culture. Had we been conquered by a Greek state, the prediction would have come out false. Had we been conquered by a neighbor, the prediction would have come out false. We were conquered by Rome, which spoke Latin. The prediction came out true. Prediction says that they'll come to the ends of the earth. We were defeated by the Romans 3 times. The third time, the legions came from England, which was the end of the earth. And those are the ones that defeated us and destroyed the temple and pushed us into exile. They destroyed the population, men, women, and children. That's documented by Roman historians. They did that only twice. They did it to Carthage and us, and it was a big deal. I mean, they created coins. We've defeated Judea. Judea is captive to us because we were a tough group, tough bunch. So these things are all public record. It's not, it's not something. Yeah.
Going back to the Jewish survival, if we can say, for example, that the Romani survived because of people wasn't trying to kill them or whatever it is, except so the only problem is that their culture hasn't survived. So what if we say that Judaism survived so many years because of this people trying to kill us, and the culture survived because of, as in, you attribute different things to different reasons. So you can say, because people are trying to kill us, that means that's why we've survived the same as the Romani, and we've survived in terms of culture because of certain things such as the laws of kashrut, some things that are intuitive, such as kashrut, such as keeping a minyan, those kind of things.
Look,
But different things to the different...
yeah, but we have a bit of a challenge here. First of all, I only used one concept of survival. That's survival of the culture. I was not talking about the survival of the genes. I didn't bring that in. I said there's two things. There are two things that need to be explained. I'm talking about the survival of the culture only. I don't have two things to explain. Number one. Number two, because I'm only talking about culture, my position on the Romanis is that they didn't survive. There may be people there, but the culture is lost. So that's the contrast that I drew between the two of them. I was not talking about the existence of genes. I was talking about the existence of a culture. And therefore, only one thing has to be explained. And as far as persecution is concerned, every place where we test persecution, it's successful in wiping people out. I'm not sure that the Romanis, except for the Nazis wanted to wipe out the gypsies. I think they wanted to wipe out the Jews. They killed more than 1 million of them. But prior to that, I'm not aware of any systematic persecution of Romanis. There were minorities that were tolerated. Jews were persecuted because Christianity couldn't allow our existence. Christianity had lots of plans to annihilate us. But the Romanis, they were just weird, fellow travelers. So I don't think that the persecution applied to them. But as far as culture is concerned, that's where cultures disappear. I'm not saying that persecution would be the only thing that destroys cultures. Cultures disappear for lots of different reasons. I was just responding to a claim that persecution preserves this culture. I said, well, let's see when persecution is applied, what does it do to cultures? The answer is, it wipes them out. Christianity wiped out all the cultures in Europe. Islam wiped out all the cultures in the Arabian Peninsula. And in Russia, the persecution wiped out 90% of us in less than a century. And if it had gone on another century, there wouldn't have been any Jews left. So that was my response to persecution. So I'm saying there's only one thing to be explained, and that's the culture. And the explanation of the culture worked the way I said it. And it's not, if there are two things that have to be explained, I agree with you. Two things to be explained could be explained by different features. They don't have to be explained by the same thing. That would be just a prejudice. But I don't need to explain one thing. I'm talking about explanation of a culture. The survival of culture. Survival of actual people, flesh and blood people, or DNA is not my issue. Yeah.
You talked about using, I guess, the God argument as a neutralization of the scientific evidence.
Yeah,
correct?
that's right.
For someone who is on either side of the fence and who just keeps hearing, oh, well, God made it this way, God made it this way, God made it this way, I think the scientific argument sounds a lot more convincing than you're just going to push it away with this God argument. How does one?
Yeah, you're not distinguishing carefully between evidence in favor on the one hand and defending against evidence against on the other hand. Those are two different matters. I'm not saying God did it as a reason to believe that Judaism is right. I didn't use that reason once. I used the NETs for the revelation and the prediction and Jewish survival as positive. But then I'm wondering how you defend yourself against counter evidence, evidence that you're wrong. That's where the critic is bearing the burden of proof, saying, I have reason to think you're wrong. There I'm defending myself against evidence, not providing evidence, but defending myself against counter evidence. There I say we can defend ourselves against that counter evidence by saying God made it that way. We can neutralize it. It doesn't count in our favor, it just counts again, it doesn't count against.
Could you provide an example of that? I'm just trying to think.
Yeah, let's take the age of the universe. Looks like, from a scientific point of view, the age of the universe is 13.8 billion years. Not hard for the all-power creator of the universe to make it look that way. So I say the appearance of 13.8 billion years doesn't count against us. I'm not saying God made it that way and therefore you should believe we're right. Not at all. I'm not using it as positive evidence. I'm just saying you want to use it against me? I can explain it away. And there's nothing special going on here. Let's suppose that you have repeated computer breakdowns. It could be that faulty software, faulty hardware, and so forth and so on, or it could be espionage, or it could be an attack, right? So you have to weigh up the evidence. Does it happen at times when we're trying to finish a crucial project in competition? Of course, a clever malicious attacker will do it at other times also, so you won't pick up that pattern, right? So you say, well, it happened also on last Thursday, and last Thursday nothing was at stake. Doesn't that count against a malicious attacker? I said, no, I can explain that away. He wants to cover his tracks. I don't know that that's true, but you're trying to give me evidence against the malicious attacker? I say, a malicious attacker could do that also, doesn't count against. Happening on Thursday isn't in favor of the malicious attacker, but it's not against him either. That's what I mean by explaining away counter evidence. So in general, when you have competing theories, each one has evidence supporting it. If they're competing, usually what supports this is against that, and what supports this is against that. So then when I look at this one, I say, well, what's your evidence in favor? Here's my evidence in favor. What are you going to do about this evidence against? Sometimes they say, we just got more evidence, that's all. Can't help it, this is against, but there's more. That's to be true. But sometimes this theory can say that evidence really isn't against us because we can explain it away. And then we have our evidence in favor and no evidence against. That's what God did it does. God did it explains away evidence against. So you're right. If somebody says God did it and uses that as a reason to believe, that's nonsense. That's not evidence in favor. At best, it's a defense against evidence against you. Yeah.
For isolating features, right? That laws of kashrus, they weren't put in place in order to preserve. You're saying that's not.
Well, I say if they were, that means somebody had to be able to understand that they would preserve.
Well, okay, look at Bissel Akum, right?
What's that?
Bissel Akum.
Bissel.
Bissel
Akum.
Bissel Akum.
Yeah.
Okay, wasn't that put in place? So even though it's according to the Torah, it's kosher. You know, it's like a bread. It has nothing in it. There's no pork in it. There's nothing in it. But it's made by a non-Jew. We can't eat that just because the rabbi said so, right? Then look at the Talmud, right? He says, don't write down the oral Torah. Torah Shabbal Pet. We shouldn't write it down. But, you know, we might lose it. People are going all over the world. So what do we got to do? We got to write it down. Yeah. You know, all these things are kind of put in place so we don't forget them.
Oh, well, okay, but there are really two different things. The two items you're citing are really in two different schools. But let's take the first one. This question is often asked, and it's often asked by people who know Torah background. You know something, obviously, and it's often asked by Torah background. I think there is a failure of context here. The rabbi said, don't eat certain things that are cooked by non-Jews. And it's true, they had in mind that should serve as an isolating factor. But who says, in the rabbi's statement, in the rabbi's mind, that it will serve as an isolating feature in naturalistic terms? They aren't naturalists. They aren't atheists. They believe in divine providence. So if you're going to take their point of view, what they're saying is, if you do this, then divine providence will protect you on the basis of the fact that you do this. Not that it works in purely naturalistic terms, because they don't believe in purely naturalistic terms. To impute to them a strategy that leaves out their major premise of their picture of the world, namely that God's running the world, seems to me to be just without any foundation whatsoever. Now, as far as writing down the oral tradition is concerned, if there weren't a clause in what had been received up until that time, that this could be done when necessary, they wouldn't have done it. And they would have said, God's running the world. If he wants it to be remembered, it'll be remembered, and there's an end on it. Right? That's why no one could say, look, they did that, so if we want to drive cars on Shabbos to get to synagogue, so we'll be... But why not? But why not? Obviously,
I was just looking at it from a perspective of this is a preservation...
Yeah, but I'm pointing out that if there weren't a legal precedent in it from before, then the same argument could be made about Shabbos also. You did that for the sake of survival, so we can do this for the sake of survival. The background to what you're saying is, for the sake of survival, anything is permitted. For the sake of survival, nothing is permitted. You can't violate any law for the sake of survival, because we aren't responsible for the outcome. We're responsible for doing what God wants. He's responsible for the outcome. He makes the outcome. So if there weren't an escape clause in the original saying that when necessary you can write down the oral, we'd never been able to write it down. And the Talmud actually cites a verse for it.